What could still break Prince Harry, decades after losing his mother, live on television? Not a protest, not a headline, not another royal controversy. A question, one sentence, calmly delivered, wrapped in politeness, asked as if it had been answered 1,000 times before. And yet, the moment it landed, something shifted. You could see it before he spoke. The pause lasted a fraction too long. His shoulders stiffened. His eyes dropped, not in shame, but in retreat. Like someone stepping backward into a room they never wanted to enter again. Have you ever felt that? That split second when your body reacts before your mind can stop it? Prince Harry did, and millions of people saw it in real time. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This wasn't supposed to happen. The interview was controlled, friendly, carefully paced. No ambushes, no traps. Harry had spoken about his mother before, many times, actually. He'd spoken about grief, about loss, about trauma. He'd spoken with confidence, with clarity, even with purpose. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't prepared. And that's exactly why it mattered. Because what followed wasn't a soundbite. It wasn't a rehearsed anecdote. It wasn't a polished reflection designed for public consumption. It was something raw, unfinished, and deeply human. A memory surfaced. Not the kind you tell stories about, but the kind that ambushes you when you least expect it. The kind that doesn't come with context or closure, just sensation. And when Harry tried to speak through it, his voice failed him. Why now? Why this interview? Why this question? And why, after all these years, did one detail finally slip out that he had never shared publicly before? To understand why Prince Harry broke down on live TV, we have to rewind. Not just to the interview. Not even just to the night Princess Diana died. We have to rewind to something more uncomfortable, more subtle, more overlooked. We have to rewind to the moment a child learns that silence doesn't mean safety. Because here's the thing most people miss. Trauma doesn't age with us. It waits. It waits while you grow up. It waits while you learn how to smile for cameras. It waits while the world tells you how strong you are. And then, one day, when you think you're safe, when you think you've said everything there is to say, it comes back. Not as a story, but as a feeling. Not as a memory you control, but as one that controls you. That's what happened to Prince Harry. But before we get there, ask yourself this. How much do you really know about that night? You know the headlines. You know the official timelines. You know the public mourning, the flowers, the funeral watched by billions. But what do you know about what a 12-year-old boy saw? Not what he was told. Not what he later learned. What he remembers. Because memory doesn't work the way we think it does, especially when it's forged in shock. The world remembers Princess Diana as a global icon, a symbol, a tragedy frozen in time. But for Harry, she was just Mom. And the night she didn't come home wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was quiet, confusing, fragmented. No sirens in his memory. No flashing headlines. Just waiting. Waiting is where trauma grows. Imagine being a child in a place designed to feel permanent. Thick walls, long hallways, rooms that echo, adults moving carefully around you, speaking in low voices, assuming silence equals protection. But silence doesn't protect a child. It leaves space, and space gets filled with imagination, fear, and unanswered questions. Harry has spoken before about not crying when he first heard the news, about feeling numb, about not understanding what had really happened. But numbness isn't absence of feeling. It's delay. Think about it. When something is too big, too final, too impossible to process, the mind doesn't collapse. It freezes. It stores pieces, fragments, images, sounds, sensations. And sometimes, those fragments stay buried for decades, until a question unlocks them. The interviewer didn't know that. The audience didn't know that. Maybe even Harry didn't know that. That's the unsettling part. Because if you don't know what your own mind is holding on to, how can you prepare for it? This is why the moment felt so jarring. Not because Harry cried, not because he showed emotion, but because it looked like he was discovering something at the same time we were. Have you ever said something out loud and immediately thought, I didn't know that was still there? That's what we witnessed. And it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about grief. Closure is often a myth. Especially when the loss happens before you have language for it. When Princess Diana died, the world wrapped her sons in ritual, ceremony, Expectation. They were expected to walk, to wave, to grieve with dignity, to be symbols of composure in the face of unimaginable loss. But children don't grieve symbolically. They grieve physically, in tight chests, in sleepless nights, in memories that don't make sense yet. Harry grew up under the assumption that time would heal what silence could not, that maturity would organize the chaos, that adulthood would turn pain into perspective. And for a long time, it probably did. Until it didn't. Because trauma doesn't disappear. It reorganizes itself around your life. It hides in the spaces you don't examine. It waits until you feel safe enough to feel it. And live television, ironically, can feel safe when you think you're in control. That's why this moment matters now. We live in an era obsessed with exposure, with confession, with telling your story. But we rarely talk about what happens when a story tells you instead. Harry wasn't setting out to reveal anything shocking. He wasn't chasing headlines. He wasn't trying to reframe the past. He was answering a question. And that's what made the breakdown so unsettling to watch. Because it wasn't performative. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't even fully conscious. It was a memory knocking from the inside. And when he opened the door, just slightly, something slipped through. A detail, small, chilling, and deeply revealing. Not because it changes history, but because it changes how we understand the cost of living inside it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before that detail surfaced, before the silence, before the visible struggle to continue speaking, there was a moment almost no one noticed. A moment when Harry stopped being Prince Harry and became a boy again. That transition, the instant where the present dissolves into the past, is where this story truly begins. Because once you understand that moment, everything that follows makes sense. The breakdown, the pause, the words he almost didn't say, and the question that opened a door he may have spent a lifetime trying to keep closed. But what was that question really asking? And why did it succeed where years of interviews, documentaries, and public statements never had? Because what came next wasn't just emotional. It was revealing. And once it was said, there was no going back. That's the part that still unsettles people who replay the clip. Not a challenge, not a confrontation, not even a deeply probing inquiry. Just a question that had been asked before, in different forms, across different years, by different voices. And yet, this time, it landed differently. Have you ever noticed how the most dangerous questions are the ones that sound harmless? The interview had been moving smoothly, almost comfortably. Harry was relaxed, leaning back slightly, shoulders loose, speaking with that familiar mix of confidence and caution that comes from years of public scrutiny. He smiled when appropriate. He nodded along. He seemed present, grounded, in control. This wasn't a man bracing for impact. This was a man who thought he knew where the conversation was going. And then the interviewer shifted. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough. The tone softened. The cadence slowed. And then came the question. It wasn't framed as a challenge. It wasn't aggressive. In fact, it sounded almost compassionate. Curious. Human. Something along the lines of how Harry still carries his mother with him. A question about memory. A question about Diana. Nothing extraordinary, at least on the surface. But something about it was different. Something about the timing. The wording. The way it bypassed Harry's usual defenses. Because instead of asking what Diana meant to him now, it brushed dangerously close to what he remembered then. And memory is a place you don't visit accidentally. You could see it the instant the words finished leaving the interviewer's mouth. Harry didn't answer right away. That alone was unusual. He paused. Not the thoughtful pause of someone choosing the right phrasing, but the heavier kind. The kind where time stretches just a little too long. Where the silence starts to feel loud. His eyes dropped. Not dramatically. Not like someone playing to the camera. More like someone checking the ground before stepping backward. Have you ever watched someone realize they've been asked the wrong question at the wrong time? That's what this looked like. Because here's the contradiction that matters. Prince Harry has spoken about his mother more openly than almost any other royal figure in modern history. He's spoken about her influence, her warmth, her absence, her legacy. He's connected her death to his mental health struggles, to his anger, to his activism. So why did this question hit differently? Why did this one stop him cold? The answer lies not in what was asked, but in what wasn't. The interviewer didn't ask for a story, didn't ask for reflection, didn't ask for meaning. They asked about memory. And memory doesn't behave. Memory doesn't organize itself into clean narratives. It doesn't wait for you to prepare. It doesn't care if you're on live television. It just arrives. And when it does, it doesn't knock politely. Harry's breathing changed. Subtly, but noticeably. A slightly deeper inhale. A pause on the exhale. His jaw tightened, not with anger, but with restraint. This wasn't discomfort. This was containment. He was holding something back. The interviewer noticed it too. You can see the flicker of hesitation. The micro moment where they consider redirecting, softening, pulling back. But it's too late. The question is already out there. And once a question enters the room, it doesn't leave just because no one answers it. Harry tried to smile. It didn't quite work. You've seen that smile before. The one people use when they're buying time. When they're trying to bridge the gap between what they're feeling and what they're supposed to show. He cleared his throat. And that's when it became clear. This wasn't about Diana as a public figure. This was about Diana as a presence suddenly felt. Because instead of launching into a polished response, Harry did something unexpected. He admitted, quietly, that he wasn't sure how to answer. That alone was revealing. Think about it. A man who has written books, given speeches, participated in countless interviews, suddenly unsure how to respond to a question about the most formative event of his life. That tells you something. It tells you this wasn't territory he'd mapped before. Or at least, not consciously. The interviewer waited. The silence stretched. And in that space, something began to surface. Not a story, not a quote, not a rehearsed thought. A sensation. Harry spoke slowly now. Carefully, as if testing each word before letting it go. He mentioned how certain questions don't just remind you of someone. They take you back. Back to a specific moment. A specific feeling. A specific image. This is where the atmosphere changed. Because up until now, the conversation had lived safely in the present. In reflection. In interpretation. But now, Harry was drifting backward. And when people drift backward like that, they don't bring context with them. They bring fragments. This is the part most viewers didn't consciously register, but they felt it. The shift from storytelling to remembering. There's a difference. Storytelling is controlled. You choose the beginning and the end. You know where it's going. Remembering is chaotic. You don't decide what comes up. You don't get to edit. And Harry was no longer narrating. He was recalling. His voice dropped slightly, not in volume, but in pitch, a sign of grounding or an attempt at it. His hands, previously relaxed, now rested more firmly, fingers interlaced. Anchoring behavior. That's what people do when they feel something pulling at them. Have you ever felt your body react to something before you understood why? That's what we were watching. Harry mentioned how the question brought him back to being young. Younger than people remember him as. Younger than he remembers himself, as most days. He didn't say the age. He didn't need to. You could hear it. And then, almost as an aside, he referenced the night. Not the death. Not the crash. The night. That distinction matters. Because the night isn't an event. It's a container. It holds waiting, confusion, uncertainty, half-understood whispers, doors opening and closing. Adults trying to act normal while everything is not. Children remember nights like that not as timelines, but as atmospheres. And that atmosphere was creeping into the room. Harry stopped again. This pause was different. Shorter, sharper, like he'd hit something. His eyes flicked upward briefly, not to the interviewer, but somewhere else. Somewhere internal. That's when his voice cracked. Just slightly. Not enough to stop him from speaking. But enough to reveal the effort it was taking to continue. This is the moment most people remember. But it's not the most important part. The most important part is what happened just before it. Because right before his voice faltered, Harry began a sentence he didn't finish. He started to say something about what he remembers. Not what he was told. Not what he later learned. What he remembers. And then he stopped. Why stop there? Because that's the line between public narrative and private experience. Once you cross it, you can't uncross it. Harry knew that. You could see the calculation happening in real time. Not strategic, protective. Do I say this? Do I keep going? Do I open this door? And remember, this is live television. There's no edit. No second take. No opportunity to reframe later. If he says it, it's out there. The world will hear it. And more importantly, he will have to hear himself say it. That's often the hardest part. Because sometimes, we keep things unspoken not to protect others, but to protect ourselves from fully acknowledging them. Harry inhaled. And then, Against every instinct of self-preservation, he continued. Not with a dramatic reveal, not with an accusation, with a detail, a small one, almost insignificant, unless you understand trauma. Because trauma lives in details, not the big events, not the headlines, the fragments, the way a room felt, the quality of the silence, the thing that didn't make sense at the time. And as Harry edged closer to that detail, his composure began to unravel. His eyes glistened, not with theatrical tears, but with the sudden moisture that comes when emotion bypasses control. This wasn't grief as performance. This was grief as interruption. The interviewer leaned forward slightly now, listening, alert, aware that something unscripted was happening. The audience leaned in too, whether they realized it or not. Because everyone could feel it. Something was about to be said that hadn't been said before. Something that had been held back, not because it was forbidden, but because it was unfinished. And when Harry finally tried to articulate it, his voice betrayed him. He broke, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like someone realizing mid-sentence that they are no longer in the present, that they've gone somewhere else entirely. And that's when the room changed. Because once a person breaks like that, not for effect, not for sympathy, you can't pretend you didn't see it. You can't unsee the cost of carrying something alone for so long. And you can't ignore the question that now hangs in the air. What exactly did Prince Harry remember that night? And why did remembering it, right there, right then, hit him harder than decades of public reflection ever had? Because the answer to that doesn't just explain the breakdown. It explains everything that followed. But before we can understand that detail, before we can grasp why it mattered so much, we have to go back even further. Back to the boy he was before the world decided who he needed to be. Because what Harry remembered didn't start that night. It started with who he was before it. It's easy to forget that before Prince Harry became the man the world scrutinizes, before the headlines, the speeches, and the public appearances, he was just a boy. A boy with a mother he adored. A boy navigating a world that didn't always make sense. A boy who didn't yet understand how fragile life could be. And it's that boy, the child left behind, that holds the key to understanding what happened on that live interview. Imagine a house filled with ceremony, but lacking normalcy. Thick carpets that swallowed footsteps. Long corridors echoing with adult voices that whispered more than they spoke. It was a world designed for appearances, not for childhood ease. To visitors, it was regal, orderly, calm. To Harry, it was a maze of rules, expectations, and silences that carried weight far beyond his years. Have you ever been a child, too young to comprehend everything happening around you, but old enough to feel its impact? That's precisely what Harry experienced. He was 12 the night his life changed forever. A night he didn't understand, a night that didn't make sense, a night that would etch itself into memory in fragments, not stories. The world would remember Princess Diana as an icon, a public figure whose death dominated headlines. Harry remembered her as Mum. And Mum wasn't coming home. The contrast is striking. How the public witnesses monumental loss through cameras, newspapers, and global mourning. And how a child experiences the same moment as confusion, quiet, and fragments. There are no headlines in a bedroom at night. No cameras to frame your understanding. Just questions you can't articulate, answers that don't exist, and the palpable absence of someone who was once central to your everyday. He didn't immediately cry. He didn't scream. He sat in that silence, grappling with a reality his mind could barely accept. Numbness took its place, because the brain often freezes when faced with something it cannot process. That freezing doesn't mean absence of feeling. It's a delay, a containment, a postponement of grief that will return with interest. Have you ever held on to a memory that felt like it belonged to someone else? That's what Harry carried for years, the sensory remnants of that night. The sound of hushed voices, the way the rooms felt too large, the coldness of empty corridors, the sensation of waiting and wondering. These were not stories he could easily tell. They weren't meant to be shared. They were his alone. But memories like these are powerful. They linger in your body long after the moment has passed. They shape the way you breathe, the way you approach relationships, and the way you navigate a world that sometimes demands you perform, even when you are broken inside. Harry grew up under layers of expectation. The public eye, royal protocol, media scrutiny. He learned to mask, to smile, to appear unshakable. But that child, the one who felt loss in its rawest, most disorienting form, never truly went away. He just waited. That is why the live interview was so powerful. Because in that moment, the child returned. Not metaphorically, literally. The question struck a nerve so deeply buried that it bypassed the polished, rehearsed adult and reached back to the boy who had been left waiting, who had been forced to navigate absence without guidance. And when the child surfaces in such a way, you can't control it, and you certainly can't predict it. Imagine trying to maintain composure when a lifetime of unprocessed grief converges in a single instant. Harry had rehearsed many answers, many reflections, many narratives. He had prepared for the media, the interviews, the documentaries. But no amount of preparation could shield him from his own memory, because this wasn't a story he could narrate. This was something he had to feel, to remember, to relive. And yet, even as he struggled to articulate what he remembered, there was another layer at work, the protective instinct that children develop when they grow up in public. Harry had learned to filter, to edit, to gauge what the world needed to see and what should remain locked away. But grief doesn't respect public perception. It doesn't consider timing or audience. It breaks through whenever it chooses. This duality, childhood vulnerability versus public adult expectation, is what makes his breakdown so striking. For years, he had carried the weight alone, even in shared grief. A child's grief is isolating. Adults may try to explain, to comfort, to guide, but the understanding is never complete. And when that same grief resurfaces decades later, it doesn't just bring sadness. It brings an intensity that can surprise even the person experiencing it. Think of it as a puzzle missing pieces. You've lived with the incomplete picture for years, imagining completion, adjusting your understanding, accepting partial truths. And then, someone nudges one piece into place, the question in that interview. And suddenly the incomplete image rearranges itself. The reality you thought you had mastered feels raw again, immediate, inescapable. And Harry, poised, composed, prepared, found himself confronted by that puzzle piece in front of millions of viewers. He didn't crumble dramatically. He didn't scream. He didn't collapse theatrically. He paused. He inhaled. He measured his next words. And in that pause, the child emerged, the one who had been left behind. The one who had carried fragments of memory, fragments of fear, fragments of unanswered questions. And here's the haunting part. The public, watching in real time, was witnessing an unfiltered connection between the child and the adult. The adult was speaking, but the child was reacting. The child's presence created tension, uncertainty, and vulnerability. And that vulnerability is contagious. It pulls the audience in, even if they don't consciously realize it. You lean in because you feel the weight. You sense that something profound, unrehearsed, and deeply human is unfolding. Have you ever had a moment where the past seems to crash into the present, uninvited, unannounced? That's what Harry faced. That's what the world witnessed. That's why the breakdown resonated so profoundly. It wasn't about scandal, controversy, or gossip. It was about a boy left to make sense of a traumatic night, decades later, in front of cameras that didn't care about his understanding, just the footage. And this is where the memory begins to matter, not as a historical record, not as a public spectacle, but as an emotional truth. Because what he remembered wasn't just an event. It was a sensation, a perception, a detail so subtle that it might have been dismissed by anyone else, but not by him. The child notices details adults often overlook. The shift in tone, the sound of footsteps, the pattern of shadows, the pause before words are spoken. These are the things that lodge themselves in memory and wait for decades to resurface. When the interviewer asked about Diana, it wasn't the first time Harry had spoken publicly about her. Not even close. But it was the first time that the fragments of memory, the textures of that night, the emotions he had locked away, the child's perception of an incomprehensible event, demanded to be acknowledged. He began to speak, carefully, slowly, tentatively, measuring each word against the surge of feeling threatening to overtake him. And then, almost imperceptibly, his voice cracked. Not dramatically, but just enough to betray the strain of containing decades of unprocessed grief in a single sentence. And that's when viewers leaned closer. That's when the audience became part of the moment. Because the crack in his voice was more than sound. It was a bridge connecting child and adult, past and present, memory and reality. You could see it in his eyes. The hesitation, the flicker of pain, the internal calculation. Do I say it? Do I stop? Do I continue? The audience could feel the tension even without consciously analyzing it. We all recognize those internal battles, even if they manifest differently. We all know what it's like to hold back a memory, a feeling, a truth, because the risk of releasing it feels too great. And yet, we also know the relief that comes when we finally allow it out, imperfectly, unscripted, unpolished. And that is why this breakdown is so different from others. It wasn't performative. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't curated. It was human, vulnerable, real. And that reality is magnetic. It draws attention because it exposes what is usually hidden. The persistence of memory, the inevitability of grief, and the enduring presence of the child inside the adult. The child who waits. The child who remembers. The child who carries fragments no adult can erase. And in that moment, we see it. We see the weight, the restraint, the emotional gravity that decades of experience have not diminished. The public man and the private child converge on camera, and the world cannot look away. We feel it because it reminds us of our own vulnerabilities, our own memories, our own moments of withheld grief. But what makes it even more compelling, more haunting, is the detail he almost didn't reveal. The one fragment that had remained locked away for decades. That night, that fragment, that observation, sudden, raw, unfiltered, was on the brink of surfacing. And when it did, it wasn't just a memory. It was a revelation. A key to understanding why that interview mattered, why his breakdown resonated, and why the child within him still carried so much weight. They linger in ways that defy time, memory, and logic. For Prince Harry, the night his mother died was one of those nights. Not the funeral, not the headlines, not the moments the cameras captured for the world to see. The night itself, the hours before, the sounds, the silences, the fragments, has never fully left him. And for decades, he carried it inside, unspoken, untouched, unresolved. Imagine being 12 and realizing that someone who had always been the center of your world, someone who gave warmth to every room they entered, would never come home again. The words, "never come home again," barely fit in the mind of a child. The concept is too large, too abstract, too final. And so the brain compensates. It freezes, it fragments, it holds on to pieces, not the whole. The child learns to navigate in halves, in shadows, in echoes. That night, Harry's perception was filtered through the lens of a child who had never been trained to confront mortality. There were grown-ups, yes, whispering in low tones, moving with careful restraint. There was the palace, silent yet imposing, every corridor and hallway steeped in unspoken rules. But there was also emptiness. And that emptiness is what trauma remembers. Not the headlines, not the story. The empty spaces. The moments between words. The pause in the air before anyone speaks. And that's precisely what Harry brought back to the interview. When the question about his mother came, it didn't trigger a story. It triggered a memory. A sensory memory. A fragmented echo. And in that echo, he saw himself as a boy again. Helpless, confused, waiting. Waiting for explanations that never came. Waiting for someone to make sense of a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. The human brain is remarkable in how it preserves trauma. It doesn't store events chronologically like a diary. It stores fragments, impressions, sounds, images, emotions, often in isolation. Later, when a trigger presents itself, these fragments surface, demanding attention. The interview was that trigger for Harry. The words acted like a key, unlocking doors in his mind that had remained sealed for decades. When the interviewer asked about Diana, Harry's body reacted before his mind could prepare. The pause, the subtle inhale, the tightening of his jaw, all signs of a man being momentarily overtaken by memory. But what was it he was remembering? Not just the death, not just the loss, but the night itself, the sound of whispers, the movement of people, the tension in the air, the stillness that comes before realization hits. That's the part children feel most acutely and adults often forget. Have you ever noticed how children perceive silence? Adults hear silence as absence. Children hear silence as presence. It's loaded, heavy. It carries expectation, danger, and the weight of unspoken truths. Harry, at 12, was absorbing all of it. And that absorption stayed with him, lodged in memory as sensations rather than stories. This is why his reaction on live television was so potent. It wasn't manufactured. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't even fully conscious. It was the collision of past and present, the boy and the man, memory and reality, feeling and articulation. And in that collision, something extraordinary happened. His voice faltered, not in theatrics, but in honesty. The break was subtle but undeniable. A microsecond where the child inside him surfaced, demanding recognition. And in that microsecond, the audience glimpsed the truth behind decades of public composure. Because let's be clear, grief does not age with us. It doesn't respect public expectation or celebrity status. It waits patiently, silently, buried under routine, appearances, and careful articulation. But it waits only until it feels safe enough, or perhaps forced enough, to surface. For Harry, the interview was both. Safe in the sense of control. He could choose his words, moderate his expressions, redirect, but unsafe in the sense that the question bypassed every learned defense. It demanded a response to the memory itself, not to the persona he had built over years of public exposure. And that is why the live moment was more than an emotional reaction. It was a confrontation with decades of deferred grief. It was a reckoning with the child who had been left behind, forced to process loss without guidance, and compelled to carry it silently for years. Yet even as Harry struggled to articulate the memory, there was a detail he almost didn't reveal. A fragment so subtle that it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But to him, it was vivid. It was definitive. And it was the moment when the child within him whispered through the adult, "Remember this. Do not forget." The tension was palpable, not just for Harry, but for the room. The interviewer leaned in slightly, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding. The viewers, even if unconsciously, leaned in too. Something unprecedented was happening. Not a confession, not a revelation in the traditional sense, but a raw, human connection between past trauma and present articulation. And what he remembered, the thing that surfaced in that second, wasn't a story of tragedy as the public knows it. It wasn't an account of events widely reported or recounted. It was a sensory, emotional, unprocessed fragment of the night that had remained in his memory, waiting for decades to be acknowledged. That is why the breakdown matters. Not because Harry cried, not because he faltered, but because we saw, in real time, the interplay between memory, trauma, and adulthood. We saw the boy and the man converge, and we witnessed the cost of carrying unprocessed grief. And here is where the story deepens. Because what Harry remembered didn't just affect him. It influences the choices he's made since that night, the way he approaches family, media, and public life, the way he navigates relationships, and the burden of being Diana's son. This memory is not isolated. It ripples through his entire life, coloring his experiences and informing his emotional landscape. But there is something even more chilling. Something subtle, easily missed by casual viewers. A detail embedded in the night itself. A detail that explains why Harry's memory resurfaced so strongly, why it nearly broke him in front of millions, and why it matters to the public today. This is the part most interviews miss. The moment most documentaries gloss over. The thing that the headlines won't capture. The fragment that stayed hidden in his mind for decades until a single, innocuous-seeming question cracked the door open. Some nights don't just end, they freeze. They linger in memory, unaltered by the passage of years, waiting to resurface in moments you least expect. For Prince Harry, the night Princess Diana died was one of those nights. Not the funeral, not the media frenzy, not the public displays of grief. The night itself, the hours, the sounds, the silences, the fragments, remained intact in his memory, unprocessed and raw. And when the question on live television nudged that memory, it was like opening a vault that had been sealed for decades. Imagine being 12 years old, sitting in a room that feels both familiar and alien, realizing that someone who was the center of your universe, who had always been your anchor, was gone forever. Try to imagine understanding, in the marrow of your bones, that the permanence of absence is real. It's too much for any child, yet Harry had to live through it. The mind cannot process such finality in the way adults do. Instead, it freezes, holding fragments, sounds, images, feelings. Scattered, incomplete, waiting. That night, the palace, usually a place of order and ceremony, became a maze of whispered conversations and hushed movements. Corridors that once seemed protective now felt vast and echoing. Rooms that normally conveyed warmth and familiarity were heavy with silence and tension. Adults moved cautiously, assuming that their restraint would shield the children. But silence does not protect, it amplifies confusion. For a child, silence is heavy with implication. It signals danger, mystery, and uncertainty. Harry absorbed all of it. Not consciously, but deeply. Every subtle shift in tone, every footstep in the hallway, every pause before a word was spoken, these became etched in his memory. The sensory impressions were more vivid than any factual narrative could be. They became the core of his grief, independent of the public's perception or the widely reported story. He was not simply mourning the death of a parent. He was absorbing the overwhelming weight of a world that had been turned upside down, a world where the rules no longer made sense. The thing about trauma is that it does not dissolve with time. It does not adhere to calendars, anniversaries, or rational schedules. It waits. It organizes itself around the life that continues to unfold. It waits until you are confronted with a trigger, an image, a sound, a question that brings it to the surface. And when it does not come politely. It arrives all at once, demanding recognition, demanding response, demanding emotional reckoning. That is exactly what happened on the live interview. The question about his mother was innocent in tone, unthreatening in phrasing. And yet, for Harry, it was the key that unlocked the door to a memory he had carried in fragments for decades. The pause that followed the question was telling. Not hesitation from fear of public scrutiny, but a pause born of the sudden, overwhelming presence of memory. He inhaled, slightly. His jaw tightened. Subtle micro-expressions betrayed the internal struggle, trying to articulate something that had no simple articulation. The child inside him, the one who had navigated that frozen night alone, was surfacing, and he had no rehearsed lines ready. There was no prepared statement, no polished narrative. Just raw recollection pressing against the walls of composure. And what does a 12-year-old remember on a night like that? Not facts, not headlines, not the sequence of events. Sensory impressions, the way shadows moved across the floor, the pitch of footsteps, the tone of adult voices, the pauses in conversation that meant nothing to them but carried everything, the sensation of waiting, the tension in a room where nothing felt safe anymore, the immensity of a sudden, incomprehensible absence. This is the memory that surfaced on air, not a dramatized account, not a political statement, not a curated moment for public consumption, but a fragment of lived experience, raw and unfiltered. And when it began to surface, Harry's body betrayed him. His voice faltered, cracked slightly, an almost imperceptible shift that revealed the extraordinary effort required to continue speaking. It was subtle enough that many viewers might have missed it consciously, yet the impact was undeniable. The human brain recognizes such cracks instinctively. We lean in. We pay attention. We empathize. Something unpolished, authentic, and vulnerable commands attention in a way no script can. And in that brief moment, the child and the adult coexisted visibly for the audience, creating tension and emotional gravity that resonated far beyond the words themselves. The interviewer leaned forward, aware of the gravity unfolding. The pause stretched, and then Harry spoke, slowly, deliberately, measuring every syllable against the surge of unprocessed emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. He began to describe the night, not as a narrative, but as impression, not as a sequence of events, but as sensation, not as a story the world could digest, but as a fragment that only he had held on to all these years. And then came the detail. A subtle, almost imperceptible revelation, one he had never shared publicly before. A fragment so vivid in his memory that he could not ignore it. It wasn't sensational in the way tabloids understand sensational. It was chilling because of its intimacy and its specificity. It was the kind of detail only a child's perspective could preserve, unfiltered by adult interpretation or public expectation. This is the essence of what made the breakdown so compelling. It wasn't about theatrics. It wasn't about celebrity vulnerability. It was about human memory asserting itself, demanding acknowledgement, forcing the present to confront the past. It was the collision of experience and time, the boy and the man, grief deferred but never erased. We watch it and recognize our own deferred grief, our own frozen nights, our own memories that we tuck away, believing they no longer matter, only to have them resurface unbidden when a question, a smell, a sound, or a sensation brings them back with startling immediacy. Harry's breakdown reminds us that grief is not linear. Trauma does not adhere to schedules, and memory is not a story, it is a living presence. And yet, the audience did not just witness a breakdown. They witnessed the unveiling of something private, something long held, something that had shaped Harry's life in profound ways. The moment connects his past to the present, offering insight into why he navigates the world as he does, why certain decisions resonate with deeper meaning, and why the child he was remains inseparable from the man he has become. But there is more to the story. The fragment he remembered, the detail that surfaced in that fleeting second, is not merely personal. It has consequences. It informs relationships, decisions, and the way he has lived with public scrutiny while carrying private trauma. It is subtle, but profound. And it is the key to understanding why that interview mattered, why viewers were so captivated, and why Harry's composure faltered when it did. The detail itself, the thing almost unsaid, is a thread that connects past, present, and future. It is a reminder that some nights do not end. They linger. They shape us. They define the contours of memory, of identity, of emotion. And once you confront them, even decades later, there is no turning back. That's the truth Prince Harry confronted on live television, whether he realized it or not. The night his mother died didn't exist as a neat narrative in his mind. It existed as fragments, sounds, shadows, silences, textures, impressions. And those fragments carried emotional weight far heavier than the events themselves. Trauma chooses what to preserve, and in Harry's case, it preserved the moments that shaped him, the moments that lingered in his chest for decades, demanding attention at the least convenient times. Have you ever noticed how some memories rise unbidden? Not because they're conscious thoughts, but because the emotional imprint refuses to fade? That's trauma's signature. It stores the moments your mind cannot yet comprehend, and when triggered, it resurfaces as a wave. Sudden, intense, and unavoidable. For Harry, the live question about his mother was that trigger. A perfectly innocent question, yet it opened the floodgates to decades of unprocessed emotion. And here's the paradox. He had spoken publicly about his grief countless times before, in documentaries, interviews, speeches. Yet, for all that articulation, the child inside had remained largely untouched, concealed beneath layers of composure, humor, and duty. That night, that singular detail, that fragment of memory that trauma had preserved with surgical precision, demanded acknowledgement. And when it surfaced, he had no choice but to respond. Imperfectly, haltingly, painfully human. It's important to understand what trauma does. It does not respect timelines. It does not bow to convenience. It does not conform to our narrative expectations. Trauma's memory is selective, and its timing is ruthless. A detail hidden for decades can suddenly, unexpectedly, assert itself in full clarity. And when it does, the adult mind struggles to mediate, filter, or suppress. You can see it on Harry's face, the micro-expressions, the brief tremor of his jaw, the subtle hitch in his voice. These are not calculated behaviors. They are physical manifestations of memory insisting on recognition. To appreciate this, one must look back at Harry's childhood. A boy navigating a palace filled with rules, rituals, and a constant awareness of observation. He was surrounded by adults who believed that discretion equaled protection, silence equaled safety. But for a child, silence is heavy with meaning. It amplifies confusion. It heightens perception. It teaches lessons the adults may never intend to convey. Harry learned to notice patterns, to interpret pauses, to read subtle shifts in tone, not because he wanted to, but because survival demanded it. And this awareness became a double-edged sword. On one hand, it cultivated resilience, composure, and intelligence beyond his years. On the other, it preserved trauma with surgical precision, storing it in layers that years of public scrutiny could not erase. It waited, quietly, patiently, until a moment like that interview demanded its presence. Harry's hesitation before answering was a window into this complex interplay. The pause was not confusion, not indecision, it was recognition. Recognition of a memory that had been preserved exactly as it happened, unfiltered, unaltered, emotionally charged. The child inside him had been left to process the night alone. The adult had spent decades learning to contain that memory. And in that fraction of a second on live television, those two cells collided. His voice cracked, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to signal the emotional weight pressing through decades of restraint. He began to articulate something he had not previously spoken aloud, a fragment, a sensory impression, a detail that had remained private, intimate, and unprocessed. The detail was small, almost invisible, yet it carried the magnitude of all the suppressed grief, fear, and helplessness of the 12-year-old boy he once was. And this is where we must distinguish between grief and trauma. Grief is the conscious experience of loss. Trauma is the imprint left behind, lodged in the nervous system, resurfacing unpredictably, shaping reactions, choices, and relationships. Harry was confronting both simultaneously. On live television, for the world to see. The interviewer noticed it too. You can see the shift in posture, the heightened attention, the subtle awareness that the conversation had left rehearsed territory. The audience, even if unconsciously, leaned in as well. Because moments like this, raw, unfiltered, human, command attention. They bypass intellectual filters and speak directly to empathy. And here is the critical point. Harry's breakdown was not a failure of composure. It was a display of memory asserting itself, of trauma demanding acknowledgement. For decades, the fragments of that night had been preserved, invisible to the public, contained beneath layers of adult experience. That question, however innocuous, accessed the storage vault, and the memory surfaced in full force. Have you ever experienced a moment when something you thought you had dealt with decades ago suddenly returns, vivid and overwhelming? That is precisely what Harry lived in that instant. The child inside him, the one who had been left with fragments, alone, confused, and scared, stepped forward. The adult had to find words, a bridge to articulate the unarticulated. And in that process, vulnerability, authenticity, and memory converged. The subtle detail he revealed, one he had never shared publicly, was a testament to the specificity with which trauma preserves experience. Trauma remembers not broad strokes, but fragments, the quality of a sound, the movement of a shadow, the precise sequence of fleeting sensations. These are the details that remain when everything else is filtered or forgotten. And it was this fragment that brought the live moment to life in a way no prior interview, book, or documentary could. The impact was immediate, though understated. A small crack in his voice, a pause in the rhythm of speech, the glisten of unshed tears, all signals of the intensity of unprocessed memory meeting public exposure. For viewers, the moment was magnetic. It wasn't just a breakdown. It was a bridge connecting child and adult, memory and present reality, private grief and public attention. And yet, as powerful as the moment was, it also left questions unresolved. Because trauma, by nature, does not resolve itself neatly. It persists. It shapes behavior. It influences decisions. It lingers in relationships and choices. Harry's reaction on live television was only a glimpse of that ongoing influence, a manifestation of decades of unprocessed grief and memory. The audience could feel it intuitively. Even those unfamiliar with the intricacies of trauma could sense the gravity. The subtle falter in his voice, the hesitant phrasing, the minute gestures, all conveyed the depth of experience without explicit explanation. It was raw. It was unfiltered. It was real. And that reality is what captivated viewers and made the moment unforgettable. But what exactly did he remember? What detail, preserved so vividly for decades, surfaced in that brief interaction? What fragment of a night so formative, so traumatizing, had remained locked inside? waiting for a question to release it. That detail is the key to understanding not just the breakdown, but Harry's ongoing relationship with grief, memory, and identity. And it is the detail that we will explore next. Because to fully understand the impact of that live television moment, we must examine what trauma chooses to preserve, and why some memories remain hidden until they cannot be contained any longer. The moment came quietly, not with fanfare, not with dramatic build-up. It arrived in a subtle shift, a pause, a hitch in his breath, a slight tremor in the jaw. For most viewers, it was almost imperceptible, yet for anyone paying attention, it was unmistakable. Prince Harry was teetering on the edge of a memory that had lain dormant for decades, a memory that demanded recognition in a way that words alone could scarcely contain. To understand why this moment was so significant, we need to consider the nature of memory. Memory is rarely linear. It doesn't present itself as a clean narrative, neatly packaged for storytelling. Instead, it surfaces in fragments, impressions, and sensations. It is unbidden, unpredictable, and often overwhelming. And when trauma is involved, memory is even more selective. It preserves not what is convenient, but what hurts the most, the details that embed themselves into the nervous system, shaping reactions, behaviors, and emotional responses for a lifetime. Harry's breakdown on live television was the convergence of all these factors. The question about his mother acted as a trigger, unlocking a fragment of memory that had been stored with painstaking precision. The child inside him, the boy who had been left alone to process loss at 12, was no longer contained. He surfaced through the adult's voice, through the micro-expressions, through the subtle falters that betrayed the effort to maintain composure. Have you ever noticed how grief can feel instantaneous, even decades after the fact? That's what happened here. Decades of emotional containment, carefully cultivated public composure, and rehearsed narratives collided with an unprocessed fragment of the past. The result was an unfiltered human response that the audience could not help but notice. The detail he revealed, though small in description, was monumental in significance. It was a sensory memory, the way a room felt, the particular echo of footsteps, the tension in the air that even adults couldn't fully articulate. To a child, these details are magnified. They are not just observations, they are survival cues. They imprint on the mind with an intensity that endures. And for Harry, one such fragment had waited silently for decades until a question coaxed it into the present. And yet, the most striking aspect of the moment was not the memory itself, but Harry's interaction with it. Trauma often isolates. It keeps memory locked away, separated from narrative and interpretation. For most of his life, Harry had carried these fragments in solitude, managing them privately while presenting a composed front to the world. But on live television, the containment failed. The child's memory surged forward, and the adult had to respond, to acknowledge, to articulate, to live in the moment simultaneously with the past. The physical signs were telling. His hands tightened slightly, interlaced to maintain control. His breathing shifted, not in panic but in effortful grounding. His voice, carefully measured, betrayed the strain of containing decades of unprocessed emotion. These micro-gestures speak volumes to anyone familiar with trauma. They are the body's language when words are insufficient. And yet, the moment was not merely about trauma resurfacing. It was about revelation. The fragment he shared, small as it was, shed light on the profound complexity of his experience as Diana's son. It revealed the depth of the emotional imprint left by her death, the nuances of his childhood experience, and the ways in which public perception has often missed the private reality of growing up under such extraordinary circumstances. The interviewers sensed this shift. You can see it in their subtle movements, the tilt of the head, the slight forward lean, the heightened attentiveness. They knew something unprecedented was unfolding. A raw, unmediated glimpse into the intersection of memory, trauma, and identity. And the audience, too, felt it intuitively. Something real was happening, something unfiltered, something that could not be rehearsed or edited. At that moment, Prince Harry was no longer simply a public figure answering a prepared question. He was the boy again, experiencing the night through fragments. The waiting, the uncertainty, the unspoken tension, the incomprehensible absence of his mother. The adult inside him tried to translate that memory into words, but words were never sufficient. They never can be. The depth of childhood trauma, once triggered, exceeds verbal expression. This is why the breakdown resonated. It wasn't performative. It wasn't calculated. It was memory asserting itself, demanding recognition, and forcing both the adult and the audience to confront the lingering presence of grief. The subtle crack in his voice, the micro gestures of control, the pause before each word, all of these signaled a profound truth. Trauma, when unprocessed, does not disappear. It waits, it endures, and when summoned, it demands acknowledgement. And the detail he revealed, the fragment that surfaced, was the bridge connecting past to present. It contextualized the breakdown, giving viewers a tangible sense of the emotional weight he had carried for decades. It illuminated why he had lived as he did, why his behavior and choices were influenced by events most people would never witness, and why the question about his mother had the power to pierce the carefully maintained veneer of composure. But even as he shared this fragment, the moment was incomplete, because memory is never fully contained in words. The child inside him, the one who felt the night in ways adults cannot fully comprehend, remained present, observing, reacting, and shaping the response. And this interplay, the adult articulating, the child reliving, is what makes the live breakdown so uniquely compelling. It is an unfiltered window into the enduring impact of early trauma. For viewers, this moment was a masterclass in emotional resonance. It illustrated the power of memory, the persistence of trauma, and the complexity of grief that defies time, expectation, and narrative control. It reminded us that the experiences of childhood do not simply fade away. They live within us, shaping responses, informing decisions, and influencing behavior in ways that only surface under specific triggers. And so the moment ended, almost as quietly as it began, leaving viewers with a mixture of empathy, curiosity, and awe. The fragment of memory had been acknowledged, the child's presence had been visible, and the audience had witnessed a rare intersection of past and present, trauma and articulation, grief and identity. Yet questions lingered. What precisely had Harry remembered? What fragment, preserved for decades, was powerful enough to surface so strongly on live television? And what did this reveal about his ongoing relationship with grief, memory, and public life? The detail was almost imperceptible. A fragment of memory so subtle that it could have been overlooked by anyone not attuned to the nuances of trauma. Yet for Harry, it was vivid, undeniable, and powerful. It was not the public story. It was not the crash. It was not the funeral. It was the sensory and emotional residue of a night frozen in time, preserved with the clarity only trauma can provide. Think about how children experience overwhelming events. They do not process them logically. They do not encode them as coherent narratives. They encode impressions, fragments, sensations. A shadow across a room, the echo of hurried footsteps, the tense, hushed tones of adults, the smell of antiseptic or perfume, the pause between words. These fragments embed themselves into the nervous system, often unnoticed, waiting decades to resurface. Harry's memory worked in exactly this way. That night, in the palace, he had been a child navigating a maelstrom of confusion and fear. He had no words to articulate what he was feeling, no context to frame the experience. So he absorbed it in pieces. And now, decades later, those pieces demanded recognition. When asked about Diana on live television, that fragment surged forward. The subtle inhalation, the pause before speaking, the hitch in his voice, all signs of the memory pressing through years of containment. And then came the detail. A specific, sensory impression that had remained hidden, private, preserved in the quiet corridors of his mind. It was a moment of observation that seemed insignificant at the time, but had lodged itself deeply. A gesture, a sound, a fleeting exchange of words, almost imperceptible, that encapsulated the surreal horror and helplessness of a child witnessing an adult world unravel. For years, Harry had carried this detail silently, shaping his emotional responses, his relationships, his public persona, without ever fully articulating it. And now, it surfaced, not with dramatics, not with showmanship, but with the raw authenticity of memory asserting itself. The interviewer leaned forward, sensing the gravity. The audience, whether consciously or not, felt the intensity. Something deeply human was happening. The child within Harry was reliving a moment, and the adult was tasked with articulating it. Have you ever experienced a memory so vivid that it feels immediate, as if time had collapsed, and you are back in the room, in the moment, unable to escape? That is precisely what Harry was navigating. And in that navigation, we witnessed the interplay of trauma, memory, and resilience. His voice cracked slightly as he conveyed the detail. His hands shifted, seeking grounding. Every micro-expression betrayed the effort required to translate raw memory into coherent speech. And yet, he continued, because that is what trauma demands: acknowledgement, recognition, articulation. Even if incomplete, even if imperfect, this detail, almost invisible in description, was monumental in effect. It illuminated the depths of his experience, the child's perspective on that night, and the enduring impact of unprocessed grief. It connected the personal to the public, the private trauma to the live moment, creating a resonance that no audience could ignore. But the detail also raised questions. Why had it remained hidden for decades? Why had he never shared it before? And what does it tell us about the man he has become, the decisions he has made, and the way he navigates the world? The answers lie not just in the memory itself, but in how it has shaped his life, his identity, and his relationship with grief. The significance of this detail is compounded by its specificity. Trauma preserves specificity. It chooses what to keep, often leaving the broader context fragmented. And when it surfaces, it brings the full weight of past experience into the present. That is exactly what we saw on live television, a precise fragment preserved by trauma.